There was a moment when I was watching the previously on segment going into episode 10 of Andor's second season where I got kind of bummed out. It showed all these great characters I already knew weren't in Rogue One, the ones I've had such a blast watching through Andor's first season and the last month while season 2 has been on. Lonni, Dedra, Luthen, Kleya, Partagaz. I knew seeing them here meant they'd have to meet with the inevitability of making way for characters like Melshi and K2SO. To make it plain right at the beginning of this, these things are not the same regarding the amount of investment I have. It made me worried that this thing I love so much was turning into this other thing I thought was a fun time at the movies when I saw it when it first came out. In the opening moments of episode 10, which was the premiere of Andor's final 3-episode chapter, everything felt like it was pointing to an early exit for Luthen. The lingering shot of him checking his wig in the mirror and the somber tone that hangs over his exchange with Kleya at the beginning of the episode. In typical Andor fashion, he delivers a single line that says it all. I think we used up all the perfect. As he watches his words register for Kleya, he adds the slightest smile, and after a strained beat, she returns one of her own before telling him to tuck his shirt in. I know the end is coming, they know it too, and we all have to keep going anyway, pretending like things might turn out differently. I mean, there are still 3 episodes, right? A lot could happen. Think about how much happened in episodes 7, 8, and 9. Rebellions are built on hope and whatnot. This all dissolves when Lonni presses him about where they'll go when they're talking, and he says Yavin, adding that they'll be safe there. You can't really have been watching this far paying attention and not know that he's lying there. So the question changes from how their stories would end to when they'll end. It happened less than 20 minutes into the first episode, which I'm not gonna lie had me on my back foot. But then the show did what it's been doing. It surprised me. It proved it could be a faithful prequel that dots all the I's and crosses all the T's to set up the opening scenes of Rogue One and make it matter. This is a story about what it takes to make a rebellion and the making of a revolutionary. The costs, sacrifices, and moral compromises. The actions of individuals with no guarantee of recognition. It tiptoed around the idea of destiny, especially in the back half of the second season. But then there are also things like Nemik's manifesto. Penned by a character who died after being crushed by a literal cart full of money while escaping the Aldhani heist. His words went on to spread across the entire galaxy. Nemik made it matter enough that when Major Partagaz listens to his words in his final scene, his only conclusion is that his efforts to enforce unnatural control didn't matter. This is the highlight of the series finale because of these two men's relative positions of power and the contrast between the Empire and Rebellion. On the one side, Nemik didn't last long enough to rise through the ranks, but you do have Luthen at the top sacrificing everything for a sunrise he'll never see because he believes their common cause is just. On the other side, you have Partagaz, who thinks the only things that matter are the chain of command and doing the job assigned to you. He's the quintessential just following orders guy who has no reservations about how the Imperial machine consumes even its most decorated officers when it needs someone to answer for its failings. Anton Lesser conveys the weight of realizing that his life amounted to nothing but the harm he inflicted, as Nemik talks about the constant effort required for the Empire's brand of tyranny. It isn't sustainable, and men like him continue to do its bidding until cast aside when they're no longer needed. In Season 1, he said the ISB treats sickness by locating germs, whether they come from the inside or outside. And by the time he asks Captain Legret for a few moments to collect his thoughts, both of them understand what his one way out is. While this all does a fantastic job of reinforcing Nemik's core tenet that freedom is a pure idea that occurs spontaneously and without instruction, his manifesto's final words are, "Remember this, try." There are no guarantees for doing so, which means that deciding to focus most of the first 2 episodes on a character with an unknown fate brings an incredible amount of tension into the equation. In my second video about this season, I mentioned that Clea was becoming my favorite character. It was a surprise, and when I went to see what she'd been in at that time, it looks like it's possible that the first season of Andor was her first acting job. She has a few credits from that same year, so it was at least one of her first jobs. After Luthen burns his decency for someone else's future by killing Lonni, which I guess I should say might seem a little over the top or unnecessary given his crucial role, it might if it weren't for what Luthen does after Dedra confronts him at his shop. Lonni is the one character with the distinction of being someone who none of the rest of Star Wars happens if he doesn't do what he does, but also isn't even mentioned when Vel and Cassian list off all the people who sacrificed their lives at the end. To use his own words, he told Lonni last season, "The ego that started this fight will never have a mirror, an audience, or the light of gratitude, but geez, think about the pawns he sacrificed along the way." Making these types of decisions is part of what made him such a compelling character, and a big part of why the new rebel leaders on Yavin all come off as insufferable dicks when they talk about him at the end. The unfortunate ends of these two leave Kleya with the key information that makes this chapter go. And she takes the promotion from supporting role to main character as if that was the plan all along. I don't think I've ever wanted a character to make it out of something clean like I did Kleya at the beginning of the second episode. Leading up to that, Andor did what it had been doing based on the rules it set up due to the story's breakneck pace. It invested just enough in the characters to give the emotional beats meaning. A perfect example of what I'm talking about is Kleya's line about Luthen tucking in his shirt. It reminds us about their relationship, who they are to each other in a ruthlessly efficient way. What I really appreciated about this final run of episodes is that they found the time to do what great TV shows can do and show us how they got to that place. Before I get into the origin story, I do want to discuss Dedra's big move. Luthen has never been mentioned as a key figure in the Rebellion's history in any Star Wars stories that come after this show, so his downfall was a foregone conclusion. Dedra's was a little more up in the air because her side was winning right up until it wasn't. When he hears the bell as he's destroying the communications network with that really cool metallic goo that he has, and it turns out to be her waiting at his front door, it feels like there was a real chance that his end would be her final victory. There's almost a weird satisfaction in watching her pull out the Starpath unit that first showed up in the third episode of the series when Luthen and Cassian first met. I think they did a great job here because as soon as I saw the ancient blade, which probably has some profound lore meaning for Star Wars heads, I thought, oh, he's going to be able to end things on his own terms so they won't be able to torture him. She can't see this because this is her big day, when she can finally make fun of his wig and call out the rebellion for what she thinks it is: chaos. And why wouldn't she? In her mind, her whole life has been about following the rules to maintain order. What else could it be? Later, this will clarify something I guess I knew about her attraction to Cyril, but never put words to. They both fixate on the rules until something comes along that justifies breaking them, which in their minds is the thing that cuts directly to the core of why the rules are there in the first place. So, of course, even the strictest of rules followers would realize they need to be broken. For her, this thing is access. And she even tells him how much she's fantasized about how this day would play out. This differentiates her motivations from the Partagazes and the Krennics, but it's more about how she copes or justifies her actions. Her belief that if she could bring this guy to justice, it would make it worth it, turns out to be her Achilles heel, and while I was out front on how Luthen was going to complicate things, I didn't realize this was the beginning of her end until Hirt tells her she's under arrest at the hospital, which it's always a nice touch when you find out something at the exact moment it hits the character. That she can't tolerate all these heathen rule breakers out there creating chaos and making it hard for the likes of her and her fascist buddies makes it more satisfying when you hear Krennic almost blow a gasket whenever he asks why she thinks it was a good idea to try to bring in Luthen on her own. It's not until he leaves the interrogation that she understands that she'll end up like her parents. I suppose that will give her plenty of time to think about what Luthen said about the rebellion flying away and the whole galaxy waiting beginning to disgust her. Her interaction with him exposed her critical mistake, and the Krennic scene delivered the death blow. You understand why what she did made sense for her, and how Luthen becomes this symbol. Even as Krennic demolishes her, she still can't stop thinking about her next move. He only cares about the Death Star, as does the Emperor above him, and her realizing how helpless this makes her and how hopeless the situation has become after they walk away works as a fitting end. After Kleya watches the ambulance take off and sees they're keeping Luthen alive, she goes to the safe house to plan her next move. There's a fantastic shot of her standing in the middle of the space that's now empty, where she's almost still, but you notice a slight shaking as she stares out the window. The state of the place where Cassian and Bix once tried to make a home, and where they brought Mon Mothma after her speech at the Senate, really drives home how Luthen's role in the rebellion has changed over the years Season 2 covered. While she gets ready to go to the hospital to end his life, it cuts back and forth to flashbacks to what we'll come to understand was the day they met. I mentioned his wig earlier, and his one here marks him as a much younger man. Here he's an Imperial soldier engaged in a much more straightforward act of violence against some innocent citizens than Gorman was, which we only hear happening in the background because he can't face it. We learn that he was a sergeant named Lear, which is rail spelled backwards, and the slaughter of the innocents they're there to eradicate has broken him. When we meet him, he's taking slugs off of a flask he's carrying and saying "make it stop" in Galactic Basic and his native language over and over. It's a breaking point, a radicalizing experience, but you also have to wonder if he would have gone AWOL that day if he hadn't found Kleya, a young orphan child at this point hiding on their ship. Showing how she was there from the beginning and the way he schooled her into being the person she is makes what she has to do in this episode matter on a level that's beyond the difficulty involved in sneaking into a hospital that's been taken over by the ISB. Even as a child, and maybe specifically because of the way she sees things at that age, her influence on what would become the rebellion is unmistakable. In their first scene together, as we see how they start making their way selling antiquities, she's the one who drives the hard bargain to get the price they need. Her refusal to smile is a nice added touch, and consistent with who she becomes. In a later scene, after she insists on watching the execution of a group of locals, one of whom is about her age, she demands to know when they'll start fighting back. He tells her to bank her hate, hide it, and keep it alive until she knows what to do with it. In the present day timeline, she knows what she has to do, but killing the person who raised you, even if he only called her his daughter when it was useful, has to on some level put her in the same place she was when she was hiding on his ship. When you live like they did, you know what kind of sacrifices are necessary. And there's no question Kleya would sacrifice her own life for the rebellion if that's what the situation called for. In their final flashback, he tells her he needs to know she's making a choice, because he spent most of his life without ever realizing that was a possibility. This lesson ends with their first act of violence in the name of rebellion, or I guess terrorism if you prefer. They detonate a bomb on Naboo, the home planet of the Emperor and Luke and Leia Skywalker's mother, Padme Amidala. He tells her that life shows them what they stand to lose to make sure she understands their choice. Once they make that, there's no going back, and that works as a perfect setup for what she does at the hospital. The infiltration is intense, but also believable based on what we know about this character. I read an interview with the creator, Tony Gilroy, in which he gushed over this set, saying it was his favorite of the whole series, and I have to agree that the windows and the horseshoe layout are perfect for the mood they're trying to create. Having grown up on Star Wars, I guess I'll always be drawn to this very specific futuristic look that comes through a late 1970s lens, more analog than digital and more big buttons and levers than screens and touchpads. You can just make a giant room with a device that clamps over an ICU patient's midsection that you can deactivate by unscrewing a giant fire hose looking connector. As dumb as that sounds, it works so well. And the sounds this machine makes are actually perfect, as is Elizabeth Dulau, who delivers an incredible send-off for one of Star Wars' best characters. Kleya's sacrifice isn't the end of the spy thriller portion of this run, but when she returns to the safe house to send the message about the information Luthen died for out to what's left of their network, it does serve as a bridge to the end. A freaked out Drina tells Willman his radio has been making noises under their bed on Yavin. He takes it to Cassian, who seems to have settled into his new situation without Bix there, passing the time drinking and playing games with Melshi and K2SO. This is exactly the transition I dreaded going into this, but they made it feel right. Having Clea on the other end and watching the ISB devise their plan to find her made the lighter bits feel welcome. Clea is trying to make Luthen's last act matter. The ISB has sent out her picture everywhere, claiming she has an infectious disease and for everyone to stay away from her, and Cassian drops everything when he gets the call. They essentially have to sneak out of the base, and K2's reluctance keeps things light, even though this highlights the rift between Luthen's brand of rebellion and the emerging rebel leaders on Yavin. While Cassian chose to be where he is and distance himself from Luthen, he's still willing to risk everything for someone he'll call an old friend later. They have no idea what they're walking into or what they'll find, but they know this isn't a call Luthen would make lightly. When they arrive on Coruscant, they get the bad news that he didn't make it, and Clea gets the bad news that they want her to skip town and relocate to Yavin. By that time, I don't think she even expected to make it out. The only thing that matters is making sure that the information that came from Luthen's last act gets to someone who can use it. Again, Elizabeth Delisle does a fantastic job of showing her processing the options. She knows what the rebels on Yavin think about her surrogate father, and doesn't think there'll be a place for her there. And we see that in action as General Draven confronts Willman, which also shows how far this character has come. In season 1, he was still a kid caught up in the moment on Ferrix. Here, his conviction is enough to stand up for what he believes in. He's still young, but he's a seasoned rebel at this point. It helps that he's also right. None of what's happening on Yavin would have been possible without Luthen, and anyone who worked with him would know he wouldn't have made the call if he had another option. And that is what Cassian's responding to. The seeds for Clea's determination go beyond everything else happening and go back to the meeting Luthen had with Lonni earlier in the season. Using the safe house reminds us of how everyone else left. I've already mentioned the time Cassian and Bix spent there, and Senator Mothma's stopover after calling out the Emperor for the Gorman genocide. In episode 4, which would have been almost 3 years ago, he told Lonni that the moves on Gorman weren't adding up. Dedra was a hunter, not a spin doctor. She wouldn't be there just for a propaganda campaign. That's how you start, not how you finish. He needed the endgame, and they stayed there to get it even after it wasn't safe to be on Coruscant anymore. Choices like these contributed to the distance between these once comrades, as did their conversation when Cassian told her he had had enough of the rebellion and was looking to retire somewhere quiet. You want her to make it out so much. It's incredibly difficult to watch them go back and forth, with her not wanting to go to Yavin for good reasons and his not wanting to leave her there for equally good reasons, and it would be intolerable if this were the only thing that was going on. As they go in circles, an armed tactical unit is preparing to remove her from the building. These guys look like the kind of guys you'd want on your side if your goal were to stamp out some freedom. He'd got a break when the radio lit up right as his tech told him there was no way to trace back to the location without it. It gives them the upper hand, and the response is so overwhelming that there isn't a plausible version of this where Andor and Melshi could fight their way out. Or maybe they could because we know that they're in Rogue One, but then something would happen and Clea would get caught in the crossfire to add to the costs of their rebellion. Luckily, the advantages the Empire uses to cut off the rescue attempt backfire on them spectacularly when K2SO ignores Cassian's order to remain in the ship once he realizes their communications are cut off. The destruction we saw these killing machines deliver on Gorman set the stage for this to be the most satisfying example of using the tools of your enemies to defeat them that you could imagine. It hits different when the bodies K2 is spiking the life out of are fascists, and today's the day he becomes a true revolutionary. Throughout the series, Hirt has been more of a scene sharer than a scene stealer. He He plays the dutiful bureaucrat well, but he's still a paper pusher. Having him step up his role, having him arrest Dedra, and then try to offload all the blame to her, and then come for Kleya, started to stir some things up, but I would have never guessed how gratifying it would be to see K2 use him as a human shield to clear the way for this escape. This is just a great example of a scene that didn't need to exist, but absolutely fits. And like Mon on the dance floor in episode 3, one of those things that will just pop in my head randomly to remind me how good this show was for the foreseeable future. It's their ticket out and an exclamation point on the sentence, but it shouldn't take away from the weight that the end of the rebellion's time on Coruscant carries with it. Later, the rebel leaders will describe Luthen as a thorn in their side. The things that made him effective are the same things that prevented him from taking a seat at their table. They couldn't deal with him themselves, just like they can't deal with Saw. So with Luthen, it fell on Kleya. While that's terribly sad, it's also the best way for her to repay him for saving her all those years ago, and putting all he taught her to use while honoring the bond they shared, one that was rooted in rebellion and exists only between them. For me, this paired with Partagaz's final scene, which I've already discussed, is the ending. Of course, it's still nice to hear about the costs and sacrifices again as Mon talks with Vel, and Vel toasts with Cassian, and then offers shelter to Kleya, who's literally lost in the woods on a foreign planet. The rest of the episode is just everyone coming around to where we know we need them to be. Bail just decided he wanted to go down swinging, which, considering neither him or Andor are going to live to see the rebel victory, turns out to be the right choice. And I don't know, pulling out a "May the Force be with you" did something to the little kid inside me. I don't want to take anything away from it, because it hit me when Cassian waters his plants before he leaves, which I presume Bix used to do. Seeing the kid who threw the bomb in Ferrix sitting across from the woman who made the desperate plea for anyone who still believed in the truth to share the story of what was happening to them on Gorman. Seeing the former senator who was always immaculately dressed sitting in the common area eating with everyone else. Her husband heading home in the morning light in their car where they shared so many scenes, with the wife of a gangster passed out at his side. You gotta find joy wherever you can, I guess. The Force healer knowing she was right, and the messenger giving her a nod of acknowledgement. The thing that explodes when there's too much fiction in the air. And of course, rebellions are built on hope, so B playing with his robot pal on Mineral, and Bix holding the baby Cassian will never meet. That stings some, but it's also hopeful. It's a thing that's worth fighting for. And at times I've wondered about how Cassian was positioned in the series. Obviously, he's at the center. It carries his name, everything revolves around him, but the characters around him usually steal the focus. And in the end, it's just how it is. You need all these larger-than-life characters with their manifestos and unforgettable monologues because that's not what he does. He's just an ordinary guy who always does what needs to be done. Maybe there's destiny involved, maybe he's Space Jesus, but it doesn't really matter either way. What counts is that he makes it matter. The show has been amazing, so I suppose this is a victory lap of sorts. It reminds me how tight the whole thing was put together and how all the little things add up. The two images from the montage that will stick with me are Kleya waking up to watch the rebels pass and see what she worked on with Luthen for so long come alive, and Dedra staring into space in the Narkina 5 prison before lights out, seeing firsthand what she worked so hard to bring into the world. A beginning and an end, and two orphans who went down two very different paths. In my video on episodes 7, 8, and 9, I talked about how Cyril and Cassian had a similar thing going on, and I think it's worth considering. Nemik's manifesto resonates because everything he says is true. There's always a choice, so why not make it matter? And I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.